New York. One of the great cultural and financial centers of the world. Home to 8 million people. Few of whom realize the threat they face from a hurricane strike.
It's almost a certainty that New York will get hit by a strong hurricane. And the question is, when is that going to happen?
You can't really imagine the variety of human situations that will occur when a storm like this hits, except to say it will be like nothing the world has ever seen.
It's not just New York that's at risk. As global warming plays havoc with the world's weather, densely populated coastal cities like Shanghai, Tokyo, Hong Kong, and Brisbane will all be increasingly threatened by superstorms. In the light of this, a growing number of scientists now think we should be researching ways to deflect or weaken hurricanes.
We ought to at least look at the possibility that we might be able to reduce vulnerability to serious hurricanes by controlling the storm, by reducing its intensity, by steering it out to sea. We owe it to ourselves to research that possibility.
There is no doubt that a hurricane strike on a major city like New York would create enormous pressure to develop weather modification technology. But how likely is such a strike? And how bad will it be? And could the technology be developed in time to save one of the world's most important cities? Positioned over 1,000 miles north of America's main hurricane belt, New York City would not at first sight seem a likely victim of a hurricane strike.
Hurricanes tend to take fairly typical tracks. Some of them go through the Caribbean and hit Central America. Some go across into the Gulf of Mexico and hit the southeast United States and Florida. And many stay out at sea. They recurve back to the north. New York doesn't appear to be in the traditional hurricane belt, but occasionally you do get a hurricane that impacts the New York area.
Over the last few decades, as the world's oceans have warmed, hurricane behavior has begun to change. And the risk of a rogue storm deviating from the main hurricane belt is increasing.
The heat is coming out of the ocean, adding a tremendous amount of heat to the atmosphere in the form of moisture. The hurricane heat engine converts that heat energy into the mechanical energy of the winds. If we have large increases in hurricane activity, there's a greater probability that a hurricane will hit shore. And I think we're already beginning to see some signals of climate change even in landfalling hurricane statistics.
For New York to get hit, it takes a very specific storm, one that comes close to the southeast United States, and it makes a hard turn and goes due north.
That's exactly what happened in 1938, when a hurricane that was heading straight towards Florida unexpectedly made an abrupt turn.
Of all the signals of the sea, none turns the faces of hardy sailors more grim than the flags that spell hurricane warning. The Coast Guard watched it warily as it moved northward, paralleling the coast.
It was known to be moving northward, but most of the storms would do that curve out to sea. And so the Weather Bureau confidently predicted it would do so.
That night it was off the Carolinas. Next morning it was off Maryland and Delaware, apparently swinging harmlessly out into the Atlantic.
So if you read the New York Times on the morning of September 21st, 1938, up in the upper right-hand corner was a weather forecast. Cloudy with some rain.
What the forecasters didn't realize was that strong southerly winds were sweeping the hurricane northwards. And worse, with such force that the storm was moving 3 times faster than normal.
The recipe for getting a really big hurricane in New England is to have it moving very fast across the water, much faster than ordinary. The 1938 Great New England Hurricane was moving 60 miles per hour when it hit land. Its impact was so terrific that it was registered on seismograms in Alaska.
The Category 3 hurricane slammed into the shoreline at high tide, making its impact all the more powerful.
There was no warning, and when it hit, it just took everybody by surprise.
The 1938 hurricane was one of the most destructive storms ever for New England. However, New York City itself was spared the brunt of that. That hurricane went to the east of New York. So whereas that was a horrible event for New England and 600 people lost their lives, that is not the worst case scenario for New York.
Because the 1938 hurricane made landfall on Long Island, New York City itself had been spared from a direct hit. But New York may not be so lucky next time.
It's almost a certainty that New York will get hit by a strong hurricane. And the question is, when is that going to occur? We don't know for sure, because our direct historical records for New York really only go back to about 1600. And hurricanes for that area are a rare event. So to know how often New York gets hit, we really do need to go back further in time.
Because the historical records are so limited, it's been difficult for scientists to identify any trends that would help them predict when the next hurricane might strike New York. However, Dr. Jeff Donnelly of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute has found a way to go beyond the written records using a new science called paleotempestology.
Paleotempestology is the study of past storms. What we're trying to do is extend our knowledge of when these hurricanes hit and help us predict potentially what may happen in the future.
Dr. Donnelly and his team are going back in time by digging down. They are looking for signs left behind by one of the most devastating byproducts of a hurricane: the storm surge. A storm surge is a raised dome of water that's created when the low-pressure center of a hurricane, the eye, pulls water up. This dome of water travels with the hurricane, whose high-speed winds also whip the ocean surface. The result is enormous tsunami-like waves that sweep away everything they encounter. These waves are so large they leave behind clear signs that can be detected through sediment cores.
You can see that this organic layer, which is probably marsh, has sand layers above it, more marsh, sand. And so it's these sand layers that are the hurricane deposits. The storm surge is coming up over the beach and washing this sand into the marsh. So this is like a little time machine.
And the cores paint a chilling picture.
We know, for example, that this is a layer that we've attributed to the 1938 hurricane. This was the 1821 hurricane. It was the last big hurricane to actually pass over New York City. This was the hurricane in 1815. Great Colonial Hurricane of 1635. And then these storms date to 900 or 800 years ago. And then 1,000 years, 1,500 years.
Dr. Donnelly's research has revealed that over the last 1,000 years, the northeastern seaboard has been repeatedly struck by major hurricanes. Add to this the effects of global warming, and a worrying trend emerges. Not only are hurricanes likely to become fiercer, but water levels all along the East Coast will rise. Within a few decades, New York will be a mere 7 feet above sea level, which means that even relatively modest storms will do as much damage as rare, once-in-a-century storms did before.
So to summarize, basically,
To understand just what this means, the BBC asked Dr. Stephen Baig of the National Hurricane Center to predict what would happen if a major hurricane were to make a direct hit on New York.
today, but not as wet as today.
Dr. Baig's prediction is based on a powerful computer model called SLOSH.
SLOSH stands for Sea, Lake, and Overland Surges from Hurricanes. It's a numerical model that calculates the amount of storm surge that accompanies the passage of a hurricane over the shoreline. What we're going to look at is a SLOSH hypothetical study of a Cat 4 hurricane making landfall in Manhattan. This is Manhattan right here. The storm starts to approach, and now we can begin to see the radius of maximum wind approaching, and it's just about to make landfall. Here the radius of maximum winds has just passed over Manhattan, 8 feet of water there. 6 feet at the airport. The center is now right over Manhattan. 14 feet of water. The maximum storm surge is still building. 22 feet. There's 23 feet. Up to 30 feet if just the wrong kind of storm came along at the wrong speed.
Manhattan's Lower East and West Sides, the financial district, Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, Staten Island, all will be inundated by a wall of water. 90% of all hurricane-related deaths are from storm surges, and because of its geography, the people of New York are particularly vulnerable.
Because of the way Long Island and New Jersey meet, hurricanes are funneled into the harbor so that the storm surge, as bad as it is, gets intensified by the topography. And we're looking at the kind of situation that in terms of loss of life, injury, loss of property, is an enormous reality and a potential enormous disaster.
History shows us that the largest loss of life in these events is typically from the storm surge because the water rises quickly, very quickly. And if you're not savvy and you're out in the street or down in a subway or something like that, when this happens, you're going to drown unless you can get to high ground or go up in a building very quickly.
But people who escape the storm surge and take refuge in one of New York's many high-rise buildings will unwittingly face another danger from the hurricane's incredible winds.
If you're in a high-rise building during a hurricane, you want to get off the ground floors in case there's the storm surge, of course. But if you're in the higher levels, you also have the danger of the glass failure.
Just how vulnerable Manhattan's high-rise buildings are to hurricane-force winds was highlighted recently by a team of structural engineers from the University of Western Ontario. They're investigating the impact of extreme wind on building structures, and in particular, on glass.
Oh, it always jars you, huh? Yeah. This is the reenactment of what a hurricane will do to a window. When the wind moves over the surface of a building, it creates pressures. And what we've done in this box here is recreated pressures that we've measured in the wind tunnel, and we scaled up to full-scale hurricane conditions. And this device replicates that. And what it is, there's a high-powered fan here. And rather than using the fan to blow wind, we're actually using the fan more like a vacuum cleaner just to suck on the pieces of glass and the different surfaces of the building. And in this way, we replicate the effects of the wind very, very accurately. What we're going to do is look at many different films that we can put on glass to make it stronger and more resilient under the wind loads, to make homes safer for people. And so all of our research is working towards that goal.
Filmed on high-speed camera, it's possible to study in minute detail the forces exerted on glass by the hurricane's winds, and measure the complex stresses and strains that finally cause the glass to blow.
Two things can happen in a hurricane. On a windward-facing wall, the wind's going to push the glass in. You can have the glass entering into the living space, which isn't a good thing. On other parts of the building, actually, the wind wants to pull the glass outwards. And a lot of things can go with it, and so you, again, don't want to sit near windows.
This push and pull effect is most likely to occur in buildings like skyscrapers that have glass windows on all sides. There are hundreds of these skyscrapers in Manhattan, each covered with thousands of windows.
I'm not sure anyone can predict what's going to happen if a major hurricane hit a city like New York. But I wouldn't want to be on street level at all, and I certainly wouldn't want to be in the high-rise area because of all the glass coming down. That would be extremely dangerous. The other problem, if you lose windows, what happens is the wind rushes into the building and it causes the building almost to blow up like a balloon, so you get a greater deal of damage just to that internal pressurization, we call it.
New buildings are made so that they can resist that pressure. But most of the buildings in New York City, and Manhattan especially, aren't built that way. And windows are going to pop when the winds get to 130, 140 miles an hour. That's going to mean glass raining down on the people of the city and blowing through the streets like razor blades. That's one of the things that makes New York both unique and especially difficult to manage when a hurricane actually hits.
Storm surge, channeled to unprecedented heights, and the force of the hurricane winds on hundreds of thousands of windows are a deadly combination for New York City's population of 8 million people.
A 30-foot storm surge will overcome residential and business areas. There'll be bodies floating in 30 feet of water through the most intensely built up sections of New York City. People are going to be unable to leave many of the high-rises. There'll be 25 feet of water at the entrance to the building. They're going to be stuck in their apartments. High winds, flying glass, people getting sucked out of windows if they're not careful. You can't really imagine the variety of human situations that will occur when a storm like this hits, except to say it will be like nothing the world has ever seen.
How ready is the city to deal with a disaster of this scale? Richard Brodsky believes that a hurricane strike on New York could amount to the single biggest catastrophe in US history. And he also believes that the city is in denial over the threat.
In New York City, a hurricane disaster is not a question of if, it's a question of when. And the experts tell us that. But if you ask New Yorkers, well, what happens when a hurricane hits? They look at you like you're crazy. So you're dealing with a population that doesn't believe it's going to happen and doesn't know what to do.
If you say a hurricane's coming in Miami, everybody's terrified and they know what to do. because they've had so much recent experience. In New York, New Yorkers might not think to evacuate or take it seriously.
It's not that the city doesn't have a hurricane evacuation plan. It does. But when he first examined the documents, Richard Brodsky discovered they were deeply flawed.
When we looked at the New York City plan in 2005, the cover sheet was dated August of 2001. The mayor on the cover sheet was listed as Mayor Giuliani, who had been out of office for 4 years, and the companies they were relying on for telephone service hadn't existed for 3 years. No one had looked at the plan since 9/11.
The recent frightening predictions about the impact of global warming on the frequency and ferocity of hurricanes has spurred the city authorities to do something about it. A new evacuation plan has been developed.
I'm confident that we can weather any coastal storms. And on that note,
Michael Bloomberg, the new mayor of New York City, and Joe Bruno, head of New York's Office of Emergency Management, went public with it in 2006.
We've done a lot of work at OEM over these past 10 months or more.
Our plan is brand new. We revised it over the last year, and we're attempting to get the public to understand that when we say you have to go, you go. We have to be ready for it, and we are ready in New York City. Without a doubt, we will handle this for our people.
The plan is now better than it was. Some of the things that were just absurd have been fixed. Others of the things that simply don't work have not been fixed. They're still trying. They don't have the resources. They don't have the political commitment of the community, much less the leadership of the government. The plan that is now in existence can't do the job we need done.
That New York City now has an evacuation plan is a step in the right direction. But the successful evacuation of any major city hinges on a number of critical factors. In particular, time. To get people to safety, you need to be able to warn them when and where the hurricane is going to hit and give them time to go.
Currently, the average forecast track has a fairly big error. Even a day in advance, we often have errors 50 miles or even 100 miles to the left or right. Sometimes we're too fast or too slow as well.
New York City, unlike Miami, faces an added complication. As the 1938 hurricane graphically demonstrated, the further up the East Coast a hurricane moves, the faster and more unpredictable it becomes.
It may reach speeds of 40, 50, maybe even 60 miles an hour as it's moving to the north. That does not leave people a lot of time to prepare. So the next hurricane that does threaten New York, we're going to have to issue a wide area of warning, and we're not going to know exactly where it's going to hit in advance or how strong it's going to be.
Experts believe that for New York City, there might only be a few hours of warning before a hurricane strike. This is a forecaster's and an emergency manager's worst nightmare.
If one wants to know precisely where the hurricane's going to go, then you want to look at the very short-term forecast, 12 or 24 hours.
But for New York City's evacuation plan to work, they need at least 3 days warning.
To evacuate, we believe we can evacuate people in 72 hours for a major hurricane.
And it gets worse. Not only will New Yorkers get little warning, they won't know how much to trust the warning. The Office of Emergency Management may have to order the evacuation of America's most densely populated city well before an accurate forecast is available. In other words, they'll be evacuating in case of a hurricane strike, rather than because they are certain there will be one. So will the population, already dubious about the threat, agree to leave?
It's going to be difficult for the public to accept that they have to move out when it's very nice out.
You have these double binds. these almost unsolvable problems. Do you tell them when you're 36 hours out and you could be off by 250 miles? Or do you wait till you're 12 hours out and maybe you can't move them all?
Calling for people to leave their homes to evacuate is a very, very difficult decision to make, not only for the emergency managers, but for the homeowners, the people leaving their house. It's something that you hope would never have to happen to you. And in that process, especially when you evacuate the frail, the elderly, people do die. They're injured just in that process of leaving where they're at. So it's not something you want to undertake lightly.
To order a major evacuation and then discover you were wrong would set a very dangerous precedent for a city that is almost certainly going to be hit by a major landfalling hurricane sometime in the near future. But at the moment, there is no alternative solution. And New York is not the only major city currently facing this dilemma. Shanghai, Hong Kong, Tokyo, and Brisbane all lie in the path of landfalling hurricanes. They are all home to massive populations, and none of them is properly prepared. It's this threat and the lack of alternative measures that are making some scientists seriously consider hurricane modification. And the pressure to act will increase in line with the damage wreaked by superstorms.
We might be able to prevent or reduce vulnerability to serious hurricanes by controlling the storm, by reducing its intensity, by steering it out to sea. I don't think it would take very many years to come up with the technology.
But if we choose to open this particular Pandora's box, the power it could unleash would have to be managed with immense care.
In the computer, we can do some tweaking. We can make it a little warmer, a little colder, make the winds a little stronger or weaker. If theoretically you could do such a tweak, then you could change the course of the hurricane or make it a little weaker. But if you don't get the tweak exactly right, do we know what's going to happen? And I don't think we really do.
I think that the technical barriers are not nearly as large as the social and political barriers, because we rightly don't easily want to tamper with Mother Nature, okay? Even though we do it accidentally all the time. To do it deliberately is a different story.
Highlights of Arsenal v Fulham and the day's top talking points in Match of the Day 2, next on BBC 2, and then Sunday night Sparkle with Graham Norton, uncut at 11:15.